think back just for a second to the social contract you were probably taught growing up.
Right, the classic formula.
Yeah, you know the one. I mean, if you work hard, get a decent education, stay out of trouble.
Do your part.
Exactly. Do your part, and you'll be rewarded with a stable, happy life.
Yeah, it's the traditional sequence of success. And, it was never a guarantee that everything would be perfectly equal or easy.
No, of course not.
But there was this foundational belief that your effort would compound into stability. Like you put in the time and eventually you could move out, find decent work, buy a home, maybe start a family.
Okay, so let's unpack this because today's deep dive into the source material is about exactly what happens when that contract doesn't just bend, but fundamentally fractures.
It's broken.
It really is. And we're synthesizing a really stark combination of sources today to show you this. We are looking at a profound essay detailing the harsh economic reality facing young Canadians right now.
Really heavy stuff.
Yeah, super heavy. And we're putting that alongside a blistering, newly released Auditor General's report on systemic failures within Canada's international student visa program.
And on the surface, those might seem like two entirely separate conversations to you.
Right.
I mean, one deals with domestic economics and housing, while the other looks at immigration administration, border security, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But the goal today is to pull back the lens and show you the broader picture of Canada's current systemic bottlenecks. It's really a unified story about a country struggling on two fronts.
Like a structural failure.
Exactly. Failing to launch its own domestic youth into adulthood, while simultaneously mismanaging the international youth who are arriving, looking for that exact same opportunity.
Okay, so let's jump right into the domestic side of this.
Yeah.
Because the sources introduced this fascinating and honestly kind of terrifying concept called a milestone recession.
Yeah, that term really stood out.
Right. Now, we're all used to hearing about traditional recessions.
Yeah.
The ones where the economy shrinks, GDP drops, governments panic.
And intervention is immediate.
Yeah, exactly. But this is entirely different.
Well, a milestone recession is more of a slow burn. It's defined as a prolonged breakdown in young people's ability to reach the normal stages of adulthood at anything resembling a reasonable age.
Which is wild to think about.
It is, because when an economy contracts, it's treated as a sudden emergency, right? But a milestone recession is subtle. It creeps up over a decade.
Right.
And it is arguably much more dangerous because it threatens the unspoken social contract that spans generations. I mean, it's not just a loss of wealth, it's a loss of timeline.
And the numbers backing this up are just brutal. I mean, young Canadians are basically tripping at the starting gate right now.
The debt alone is staggering.
Yeah. The average Canadian graduate is leaving school with roughly $29,000 in debt.
Wow.
And they're walking into a labor market where youth unemployment has been sitting above 14% for the last year.
Which is incredibly high.
Right. Outside of the pandemic and the 2009 Great Recession, that's the highest rate since the year 2000. Plus, more than 1 in 5 young people are underemployed.
Meaning they have the skills and the education, but they're trapped in part-time or entry-level jobs that don't utilize their degrees.
Exactly. It's completely stalled.
And the historical context of those earnings is what makes this so sobering. The data shows that for the first time in recorded Canadian history, men over the age of 65 now out-earn men aged 25 to 34.
Wait, really? Over 65?
Yeah. Canadians under 45 have essentially seen zero real income growth for decades. The capital accumulation has almost entirely shifted to older demographics.
People who bought in early.
Exactly. They bought into the system when the math actually worked.
Okay, but to play devil's advocate for just a second here, because, housing has always been expensive in major cities. Every generation complains about the cost of living. So is milestone recession just like an academic buzzword for the inflation we've seen before, or is this a fundamentally different beast?
It's a fundamentally different beast, without a doubt.
How so?
Because of the structural repricing of entry into societal stability, let's look at the housing multipliers from the data.
Okay.
In the year 2000, an entry-level home in many major Canadian cities cost roughly 3 times what a young couple earned.
3 times? That seems so reasonable.
Right. You save for a few years, you get a mortgage, you move in. Today, that ratio has completely decoupled from local incomes. It now sits at more than 12 times what a couple earns in Toronto.
Oh, my God.
And over 17 times what a couple earns in Vancouver.
17 times.
Wow.
So if we apply a metaphor here, we're essentially asking young people to run a marathon, But the organizers were moving the finish line back 5 miles for every hour they run.
That's a great way to put it. You literally can't out-earn that kind of asset inflation.
You really can't.
And the result is a massive delay in basic life events. Like, saving for a down payment in those cities can now take well over a decade. And that's assuming prices don't keep rising.
Which they always do.
Exactly, which they have. In Ontario, the average first-time homebuyer is now around 40 years old.
40.
It used to be under 30. So it's not just that things cost a bit more at the grocery store. The entire timeline of a normal life has been stretched to the breaking point.
And if we connect this economic squeeze directly to human behavior, the ripple effects are just massive. I mean, if you can't afford the basic foundation of a home until you're 40, how does that affect family planning?
It derails it completely.
Yeah, the demographic data we're looking at is wild. Women in Canada report wanting an average of 2.2 children.
Right.
But the actual fertility rate has plummeted to roughly 1.2.
And the author of the essay makes a really crucial point on this disparity. We cannot casually dismiss that gap as just some, cultural shift in modern preferences.
Like people just deciding they don't want kids.
Right. People still want to have families. This collapse in fertility is a direct result of the delayed timeline.
The biological clock and the financial clock are just out of sync.
Exactly. They are no longer in sync. The extra bedroom came too late. The mortgage was too far away. The period of financial instability just stretched on too long for those families to actually materialize.
It's so sad.
Yeah.
And it also completely crushes economic dynamism. I've always thought of the ages between 25 and 40 as, the prime years for taking risks.
Yeah. Starting a business, moving to a new city.
Right. Making a bet on a new invention. But the sources show that business creation by Canadians, specifically businesses that go on to employ other people, has dropped 40% per capita since the year 2000.
40%. And when you look at the mechanics of risk, that drop makes perfect sense. I mean, why take a leap of faith when you can barely cover your baseline survival?
You can't.
The essay uses this great term, economic oxygen. Right now, all the economic oxygen in the country is being sucked up by exorbitant rent and massive mortgage interest payments.
Wow, yeah.
If 50 or 60% of your take-home pay goes just to keeping a roof over your head, there is literally no capital left over for risk, for innovation, or for growth. The economy just loses its churn.
Which naturally leads to the tragedy of the brain drain. Bank of Canada data points out that our top graduates fleeing to the U.S. accounts for roughly 2/3 of Canada's productivity and income gap.
2/3?
We are bleeding our brightest minds. They look at that 17 times housing multiplier, they look south, and they realize they can actually achieve the old social contract somewhere else.
Yeah.
I mean, if we're exporting our top-tier talent, aren't we just funding the innovation of our global competitors?
We absolutely are. And the psychological toll of this internal stagnation is starkly visible.
You're talking about the happiness index, right?
Yeah. If you look at the World Happiness Report, Canada recently dropped 25th overall. But the internal demographic breakdown is what really tells the story of this milestone recession.
Okay, break that down for us.
Well, Canadians over 60 still rank in the top 10 globally for happiness.
Because they have the assets.
Exactly. They hold the assets, they have the stability. But Canadians under 25, they rank 71st.
The 71st. Wow.
That is an astonishing generational divide in a wealthy, developed nation.
It really is an indictment of the system.
Mm-hmm.
But this inability to convert potential into stability, this whole administrative paralysis, it isn't just trapping Canadians born here.
No, it's systemic.
Right. It is completely breaking down at the borders, too, which is how we arrive at the second half of today's deep dive. Auditor General Karen Hogan's report on the International Student Program.
Yeah, this part is fascinating. Because if the housing crisis shows a lack of domestic state capacity, the international student audit shows a massive failure of administrative state capacity.
For sure.
The government attempted to use international students as an economic engine, right? Bringing in record numbers to fill college seats and supply cheap labor.
But the infrastructure wasn't there.
Not at all. Auditor General Hogan looked at how Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, the IRCC, actually managed that surge. And the findings are basically a masterclass in bureaucratic dysfunction.
The numbers are staggering. I was blown away reading this. Between 2023 and 2024, the IRCC flagged 153,000 international students as potentially non-compliant.
Over 150,000?
Right. Meaning the system flagged that they might not actually be attending the schools they were given visas for. But the IRCC only had the funding and the budget to investigate 2,000 cases a year.
Which is just a drop in the bucket.
It really is. Out of a total 4,000 investigations launched over that period, roughly 1,600 weren't even closed because the students just didn't respond to the emails.
It is a textbook case of state capacity failing to match policy ambition. Like, the federal government wanted the economic boost of hundreds of thousands of new arrivals, but they didn't scale the oversight infrastructure.
Or the housing.
Right. Or the enforcement mechanisms, or the local housing supply to match. When you exponentially increase the intake without increasing the budget for the people who process and monitor that intake, you mathematically guarantee these systemic blind spots.
And the blind spots aren't just, people slipping through the cracks. It's active fraud being completely ignored.
Yeah, this part of the audit was shocking.
Unbelievable. The audit detailed this finding about document verification. Between 2018 and 2023, the IRCC identified 800 confirmed cases where applicants used fraudulent documents or misrepresented themselves to get a study permit.
Confirmed fraud.
Yes, confirmed. But after discovering this, the IRCC took absolutely no action.
None.
92% of those individuals just applied for other immigration status while inside Canada. 105 of them were actually granted permanent residency. Another 351 were granted extensions.
Because the risk assessment units found the fraud, documented it, and then just failed to put an alert on the applicant's files to stop future applications.
I have to pause here because this makes zero sense. I mean, this sounds like a bank security guard catching a counterfeiter red-handed in the lobby and then offering to open a high-yield savings account for them.
That's exactly what it's like.
How does a federal system spot confirmed fraud and then inadvertently reward it with permanent residency?
It comes down to disjointed bureaucratic silos. The people finding the fraud are in a completely different unit than the people processing the renewals.
So they just don't talk to each other.
Exactly. Because the risk assessment team didn't input a system-wide flag, the frontline officers processing the new applications had no idea they were looking at a known fraudulent actor.
Wow.
Furthermore, that information was never sent to the enforcement arm, the Canada Border Services Agency, to initiate deportations.
Oh, speaking of the border agency, the CBSA, the audit also exposed a massive tracking gap there, too. The report looked at individuals whose study permits expired in 2024. Out of 39,500 people who had no legal status to remain in Canada, the border agency could only confirm that about 16,000 had actually left the country.
Right.
That leaves roughly 23,500 unaccounted for students in a single year. They just vanished into the domestic economy.
And when the government finally recognized the scale of these massive systemic failures, the fraud, the unaccounted students, the overwhelmed housing infrastructure, they kind of panicked.
Yeah, they hit the brakes hard.
Very hard.
Yeah.
They attempted a massive policy correction by introducing a strict blunt force cap on international students. But as often happens when policy swings wildly from one extreme to the other, the fix resulted in a completely different set of structural failures.
It's like realizing your ship is taking on water, so you weld all the doors shut. Sure, you stop the leak, but now the crew is trapped inside and the engines are suffocating.
That's a brutal analogy, but it's accurate.
The collateral damage was massive because the crash in approvals was just so severe. The IRCC initially forecasted they would approve about 349,000 new study permits in 2024.
Okay.
Instead, under the new cap, they only approved around 150,000. That's a 41% approval rate, and the projections show it dropping down to 38% by late 2025.
And the real damage was in the execution of that cap, because the initial allocation model was based primarily on provincial population size,
Which hurts the smaller provinces.
heavily disadvantages them, especially those that rely on international students to keep their regional colleges solvent. Like places like Saskatchewan and Newfoundland and Labrador were officially forecasted to get a 10% increase in international students based on their specific needs.
Right.
Instead, the federal cap hit them blindly and they suffered massive decreases of 59% or more. Almost every single province outside of Quebec saw reductions of over 59% in 2024.
59%. If a smaller province is budgeting for a 10% boost in students to fill their local college programs, rent local apartments, spend money in their local businesses, and instead they suddenly lose 60% of that projected cohort, how do those regional economies survive that whiplash?
They don't, at least not without severe institutional pain. The provinces reported to the Auditor General that they didn't even have enough time to meaningfully engage with the federal government before these caps were slammed into place.
Just zero nuance.
There was no nuance at all. And there was also a massive demographic shift in who was actually getting approved, largely due to the collapse of a specific program called the Student Direct Stream.
Oh, yeah. Walk us through that. Why did that program become such a liability?
Well, the Student Direct Stream was designed as an expedited processing pathway for applicants from specific countries. The idea was to speed up the bureaucracy.
Right.
But by prioritizing speed over scrutiny, it became a massive integrity risk. In 2022 and 2023, Indian nationals accounted for 96% of all approvals through this fast-track stream.
96%.
Yeah. And the approval rates for Indian applicants hit an astonishing 98% in 2024, even though the IRCC's own internal risk units had specifically flagged India with a high-risk profile for document fraud.
So the risk unit is waving a red flag, and the processing unit is just rubber stamping 98% of the applications from that exact region.
Precisely. In fact, of those 800 confirmed fraud cases we talked about earlier, 68% of them had been approved through this specific fast-track Student Direct Stream.
Jeez.
It was a glaring vulnerability. So the government's solution was to just cancel the Student Direct Stream entirely.
Just axe it.
Yeah. And the immediate result was that Indian student representation in Canada plummeted from 51.6% of all incoming students in 2023 down to just 8.1% in 2025.
Wow. So let's look at the totality of what we've uncovered in these sources today. We have a domestic youth population priced out of a future, completely stalled in a milestone recession.
Yeah.
And we have an international student program that swings wildly from unmanaged chaos and rampant fraud to a sledgehammer cap that guts regional colleges.
It's a mess.
It really is.
Mm-hmm.
So how is the country actually responding to these dual crises? If the root cause in both cases is a massive failure of state capacity, how exactly do you regulate your way out of that?
Well, on the immigration side, the IRCC has agreed to implement 6 new administrative measures to try and plug the holes.
Okay, what are they doing?
They're moving to a province-specific allocation model to be fairer to smaller regions rather than just basing it on raw population.
Good.
They are mandating that all applications flagged for fraud must be thoroughly investigated before a final decision is made, which, seems like common sense but wasn't happening.
Bare minimum, yeah.
They're also creating a post-approval fraud response protocol to ensure alerts are actually shared across departments.
Awesome. They're also going to start actively sharing lists of expired permits with the border agency annually so the CBSA actually knows who is supposed to be leaving the country.
Right.
And anyone who originally got in through that canceled Student Direct Stream is going to face heavily enhanced scrutiny when they apply for an extension or permanent residency. I should also mention, the sources did highlight one positive bright spot in the audit.
Yeah, the verification system.
Right. A new letter of acceptance verification system actually worked 97% of the time. They built a portal to verify acceptance letters directly with the colleges, bypassing the student entirely. So the technology and the capacity can work when properly applied.
Absolutely. As for the domestic side, the proposed solutions for the milestone recession are entirely structural.
Because you can't just tweak interest rates to fix a 17 times housing multiplier.
You really can't. The essay advocates for aggressively liberalizing zoning and land use rules to allow for more density. It calls for modernizing building codes, drastically speeding up the permitting process for major infrastructure projects, and reducing the bureaucratic barriers to starting businesses.
Give them that oxygen back.
Exactly. It's about increasing the physical and economic supply to meet the massive demand, giving that economic oxygen back to young entrepreneurs.
And naturally, these massive systemic failures have generated intense political fallout.
Oh, massive fallout.
And to be incredibly clear to you listening, we aren't taking sides or endorsing either political viewpoint here. We are merely reporting the intense polarization these sources describe.
Just looking at the facts.
Right. On one side, conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is demanding cabinet resignations, pointing to the Auditor General's report and literally calling the management of the immigration file a dumpster fire.
While on the other side, Prime Minister Mark Carney and his Liberal government argue they are actively taking control of a system that was strained by global post-pandemic movement.
Yeah.
In question period, the Prime Minister stated that temporary populations are actively dropping. He noted that asylum seekers are down by a third, foreign students are down by 60%, and temporary foreign workers are down by 50%.
Right.
He also firmly stated they are now investigating 100% of new fraud cases.
Okay, so what does this all mean for you? Can administrative tweaks, like sharing lists between border agencies or adjusting local zoning laws, actually restore a broken social contract?
It's a big question.
It is. Or does this require a fundamental teardown of how the country operates at an institutional level?
That is the defining question of this entire deep dive, because whether you are a 25-year-old born in Ontario who has been entirely priced out of a future, or an international student lost in an overloaded, mismanaged bureaucracy, the core issue remains exactly the same.
The bottlenecks.
Yeah. The pathways to opportunity have been clogged by systemic drift. State capacity, the actual ability of a government to execute its own plans, has completely failed to match the promises being made to young people, regardless of where they were born.
Which brings us to a final, incredibly thought-provoking concept from the essay. It talks about the moral texture of a culture.
I love that phrase.
Right. If buying a home, starting a family, or achieving basic stability today relies primarily on inherited wealth or parental help rather than your own earnings, the country is quietly shifting.
It's a huge shift.
It is moving away from a meritocracy, a society where your effort determines your outcome, and moving toward an aristocracy, a society where your lineage and your inheritance determine your survival.
It's a profound, quiet shift in the fabric of the country. When effort no longer equals success, the fundamental identity of a nation changes. I mean, the drive to innovate disappears when the reward is completely disconnected from the work.
So I want to leave you with this to ponder. How does a nation's identity survive when that foundational promise, the one we all learned growing up, is no longer the reality? Look around your own community this week. Think about that moving finish line. If the social contract was always meant to be a marathon, it's time to ask who is actually moving the finish line and why we are all still expected to keep running on a track that seems fundamentally broken.